My name is Emma Sullivan, and for 26 years, I believed my older sister Jessica was everything I could never be. She had the corner office, the designer wardrobe, and the kind of confidence that turned heads in crowded rooms. I was the elementary school art teacher who spent weekends at thrift stores and turned garage sale finds into something beautiful. But what happened 3 weeks before my wedding changed everything between us forever. Because when Jessica threw away my handmade wedding dress, claiming it was an accident, she had no idea she'd just destroyed something worth more than her entire designer collection. And she certainly didn't know that the quiet little sister she'd spent years looking down on was about to become the most sought-after name in fashion. What she found out about my fiancé Michael made her world crumble, but what she discovered about me broke her heart completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it happened, I was sitting cross-legged on my childhood bedroom floor, carefully hand-sewing the final pearl onto my wedding dress. The dress wasn't something you'd find in any bridal boutique. I'd spent 8 months creating it from a 1940s gown I'd discovered buried in the back of an estate sale. Its original ivory silk yellowed with age, but structurally perfect. I'd restored every inch of the vintage lace, redesigned the silhouette to complement my figure, and added delicate beadwork that caught the light like captured starlight. It was more than a dress. It was a piece of wearable art, a testament to hours of patient craftsmanship that most people would never understand or appreciate. Jessica certainly didn't understand it. She'd been staying at our parents' house in Millbrook for the past week, ostensibly to help with wedding preparations, but mostly to criticize every choice Michael and I had made. The venue was too rustic, the flowers were too simple, the menu was too basic. Everything about our wedding fell short of the standards she'd set during her own elaborate affair 2 years earlier, where she'd married David Chen, a hedge fund manager whose family owned half the luxury developments in Hartford. That morning, she stood in the doorway of our shared childhood bedroom, coffee mug in hand, watching me work with the kind of expression you'd reserve for watching someone attempt brain surgery with a butter knife. She was already dressed for her day at the marketing firm where she worked, her navy blazer perfectly tailored, her blonde hair swept into the kind of effortless updo that actually required 45 minutes and 3 different styling products. "You're still working on that thing?" she asked, stepping into the room with the careful precision of someone wearing 4-inch heels on hardwood floors. "Emma, the wedding is in 3 weeks. Don't you think it's time to admit this project is beyond your skill level and just buy something proper?" I looked up from my stitching, needle poised midair. "It's almost finished, Jess. Just a few more details." She moved closer, her critical gaze scanning every inch of the dress laid out on the bed. "I mean, I admire the effort, I really do. It's very you. But sweetheart, this is your wedding day. Don't you want to look sophisticated, professional, like someone worthy of walking down an aisle?" There was something in her tone, that particular blend of concern and condescension that she'd perfected over the years, that made my chest tighten. Jessica had always had opinions about my choices, but lately, those opinions had grown sharper, more pointed. Ever since I'd gotten engaged to Michael, actually. Michael Thompson was a freelance photographer I'd met at a local art fair where I'd been selling some of my restored vintage pieces. He'd spent 20 minutes studying a 1950s cocktail dress I'd completely reconstructed, asking detailed questions about my process, my inspiration, the techniques I'd used to preserve the original character while making it wearable for modern life. Most people glanced at my booth and kept walking, but Michael understood the artistry involved. He saw the hours of meticulous work, the creative problem-solving, the deep respect for craftsmanship that went into every piece. When he asked me for coffee, I almost said no. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked effortlessly tousled and eyes that seemed to notice everything. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, but something about the way he carried himself suggested there was more to his story. During our first conversation, he talked about his work documenting traditional craftspeople, about the importance of preserving artistic techniques that were being lost to mass production. He understood why I spent my weekends hunting through estate sales and antique shops, why I chose to restore rather than replace, why I believed that creating something beautiful with your hands was worth more than buying something expensive with your credit card. Jessica, however, saw none of that. To her, Michael was just another struggling artist without proper career prospects or social connections. During family dinners, she'd make subtle comments about financial stability and the importance of marrying someone who could provide security. She'd mention how David had been promoted to senior partner, how they were looking at houses in West Hartford's most exclusive neighborhood, how important it was to think about the future. "I just worry about you," she said now, settling on the edge of my bed with practiced grace. "I know you think love conquers all, but Emma, marriage is practical too. You're 26. You can't live like a college student forever, making art projects and dating photographers who probably don't even have health insurance." I set down my needle and looked at her directly. "Michael makes me happy, Jess. Isn't that worth something?" "Of course it is," she said quickly, her voice softening just enough to sound sincere. "I just want to make sure you're not settling. You're smart, you're talented, you could have your pick of successful men. Teachers' salaries aren't exactly setting the world on fire. And if you're going to combine that with someone who makes even less..." She let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished but crystal clear. This was Jessica's way. She never directly insulted or attacked. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt, wrapped her criticisms in concern, and left you questioning your own judgment. But what Jessica didn't know, what I'd never told anyone in my family, was that my little art projects were more than just a hobby. For the past 3 years, I'd been selling my designs online under the name E. Sullivan Vintage. What had started as a way to make extra money had grown into something much bigger. Fashion bloggers had started featuring my pieces, vintage enthusiasts from across the country. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We're commissioning custom work. I had a waiting list 6 months long and was making more money from my restoration work than I did from teaching. I'd kept it quiet, partly because I didn't want the pressure of family expectations, and partly because I loved the freedom of creating without explanation or justification. When you tell people you're an artist, they immediately want to know if you're successful, if you're making money, if you're planning to quit your day job. I preferred to let my work speak for itself, to build something real and sustainable before making any grand announcements. Michael knew, of course. He'd discovered my online portfolio before we even met, had actually sought me out specifically because he'd been following my work. He understood the significance of what I was creating, the skill involved in taking damaged vintage pieces and transforming them into modern masterpieces while preserving their historical integrity. "You know what your problem is?" Jessica continued, standing up and smoothing down her skirt. "You undervalue yourself. You've always been content with less than you deserve. This dress, this venue, this whole modest little wedding you're planning. It's like you're afraid to take up space in the world." She moved toward the closet, her heels clicking against the floor. "I'm going to help you, whether you want me to or not. Mom mentioned she was donating some old clothes to charity today, and honestly, I think you should consider adding this dress to the pile. Start fresh. Let me take you shopping in Hartford. We'll find you something worthy of the Sullivan name." My hand stilled on the fabric. "Jess, this dress means everything to me. I've put months of work into it." "Exactly my point," she said, pulling hangers around in the closet with unnecessary force. "Months of work that could have been spent on other things, more productive things. You're not a professional seamstress, Emma. You're a teacher. Stop trying to be something you're not." The words hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. Jessica had a talent for finding the precise pressure point that would cause the most damage, and she wielded that talent with surgical precision. She'd been doing it since we were children, actually. When I'd won the middle school art contest, she'd pointed out that it was only because the other entries were terrible. When I'd gotten a full scholarship to college, she'd mentioned how lucky I was that they needed to fill diversity quotas. Every achievement was diminished. Every success was qualified. But this was different. This dress represented something she couldn't understand or diminish. It was proof of a skill she didn't possess, a vision she couldn't see, a patience she'd never learned. And perhaps that's exactly why she was so determined to destroy it. "I'm going to be late for work," she announced, checking her watch with theatrical precision. "But Emma, promise me you'll think about what I said. You have 3 weeks to make this right.
Don't let stubbornness ruin the most important day of your life." She kissed my cheek with practiced sisterly affection and left, her perfume lingering in the air like evidence of her disapproval. I sat there for a long moment, looking at my dress, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like dust. The thing about Jessica was that she'd always been the sister who succeeded at everything effortlessly. She'd been homecoming queen, valedictorian, president of her sorority. She'd landed a prestigious job right out of college, married a successful man, and built the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside. Our parents were proud of her in the uncomplicated way that parents are proud of children who follow conventional paths to conventional success. I, on the other hand, had always been the sister who did things differently. I'd majored in art education instead of business. I'd chosen creativity over security, passion over practicality. I'd built a life that made sense to me, but probably looked small and insignificant to outside observers. And maybe that's why Jessica's criticism stung so much, because part of me wondered if she was right. But as I picked up my needle and returned to my work, feeling the smooth silk beneath my fingers, seeing the way the morning light caught the intricate beadwork I'd spent weeks perfecting, I knew that regardless of what Jessica thought, this dress was beautiful. It was mine, and in 3 weeks, it would be the most important thing I had ever created. What I didn't know was that Jessica was planning something far more destructive than criticism, and what she didn't know was that her actions would set in motion a chain of events that would reveal truths none of us were prepared for. The destruction happened on a Tuesday morning while I was at school. I'd left the dress hanging in our bedroom closet, carefully covered with a muslin sheet to protect it from dust and light. I'd planned to spend that evening working on the final hem adjustments, maybe adding a few more pearls to the neckline. It was going to be perfect. I came home to find my mother standing in the kitchen with tears in her eyes, and my father pacing the length of the breakfast nook with the kind of restless energy that only appeared when he was deeply angry but trying to control it. The house felt different somehow, charged with tension and barely contained emotion. "Emma, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice carefully modulated in the way that immediately told me something terrible had happened. "We need to talk." I set down my bag and looked between my parents, my stomach already starting to sink. "What's wrong? Where's Jessica?" She had to go back to Hartford for an important meeting, but before she left, she thought she was being helpful. She saw some old clothes in the closet and assumed they were part of the donation pile your mother had mentioned. The words hit me like ice water. "No, please tell me she didn't." Mom reached out and took my hands, her fingers warm and steady. "She took your dress, honey. She donated it to Goodwill along with some old coats and sweaters. She said she thought it was something old that was taking up space." The world tilted sideways. I felt my knees buckle and had to grab the counter to stay upright. "What? Mom, that dress? I've been working on it for 8 months. The wedding is in 3 weeks." "We know, sweetheart, we know." Dad's voice was rough with his own anger. I called her immediately when we realized what had happened. She says it was an honest mistake, that she was just trying to help with the spring cleaning. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe her any more than I did. Jessica had grown up in this house. She knew exactly what belonged to whom, knew that I never left anything in the closet unless it was important. She'd seen me working on that dress for months, had criticized it just that morning. There was no way she'd mistaken it for a donation item. I drove to the Goodwill immediately. Mom continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But they'd already sorted through everything and sent the clothes to their processing center in Hartford. They said it could take weeks to track down a specific item, if it's even possible." I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, my hands shaking. 8 months of work. Countless hours of careful restoration, meticulous beadwork, patient hand sewing. Gone. Just gone. "We'll fix this," Dad said firmly. "We'll call every thrift store, every vintage shop, every consignment place between here and New York if we have to. And if we can't find it, we'll figure something else out. We'll buy you the most beautiful dress money can buy." But he didn't understand. None of them understood. You couldn't buy what I'd created. You couldn't replace months of love and artistry with a credit card transaction. That dress wasn't just clothing. It was proof of everything I was capable of, evidence of a vision that existed nowhere else in the world.
I called Michael from my childhood bedroom, sitting on the floor where I had spent so many mornings working on the dress that was now lost somewhere in the donation processing system. When I told him what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'm coming over," he said finally. "You don't have to. I just needed to hear your voice." "Emma, I'm coming over. We'll figure this out together." When he arrived 20 minutes later, he found me exactly where I'd been when I called him, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, staring at the empty space in the closet where my dress had been hanging that morning. He sat down beside me without saying anything, just took my hand and waited. "She did it on purpose," I said finally. "She's been telling me for weeks that the dress wasn't good enough, that I should buy something proper. This was her way of making that decision for me." "I know," he said quietly. "I don't understand why she hates my choices so much. Why can't she just be happy for me?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of my hand. "Some people measure their own worth by diminishing others. Your sister sees something in you that threatens her, even if she doesn't understand what it is." "What could I possibly have that threatens Jessica? She has everything: the career, the husband, the house, the life everyone thinks you're supposed to want." He looked at me with those dark eyes that always seem to see more than they should. "You have something she'll never have, Emma. You have authenticity. You create things because you love creating them, not because you want people to admire you for it. You're not performing your life for an audience. You're actually living it." The tears came then, hot and angry and full of months of accumulated frustration. Michael pulled me against his chest and let me cry, his hand moving slowly through my hair while I grieved for something that was so much more than just a dress. What I didn't know as I sat there in the ruins of my wedding plans was that my dress hadn't disappeared into the anonymous chaos of charitable donations. What Jessica didn't know was that her act of sabotage had set in motion a chain of events that would expose secrets none of us were prepared for. And what neither of us knew was that the quiet photographer who was holding me while I cried had resources and connections that would turn this disaster into the most important moment of all our lives. The phone call came 3 days later, while I was standing in a bridal shop in Hartford, half-heartedly trying on dresses that felt like costumes designed for someone else's life. Jessica had insisted on taking me shopping, her way of making amends for what she still claimed was an innocent mistake. She sat in the velvet chair provided for family members, offering commentary on every dress I tried on, none of it particularly helpful. "That one makes you look washed out," as I stood in front of the three-way mirror wearing a strapless ball gown that cost more than I made in 2 months. "And I don't think the silhouette is flattering for your body type." My phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but I was desperate for any excuse to escape the fitting room and Jessica's relentless critique. "Miss Sullivan." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, with the kind of accent that suggested expensive education and even more expensive taste. "This is Victoria Hartwell from Hartwell Fashion. I believe we have something that belongs to you." I stepped out into the hallway of the bridal shop, pressing the phone closer to my ear. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number. I don't know anyone named Hartwell." "Oh, but I know you, Miss Sullivan. Or should I say, E. Sullivan Vintage. Your work is quite extraordinary. I've been following your online portfolio for some time now." My heart started beating faster. Victoria Hartwell. I knew that name. Everyone who cared about fashion knew that name. She was the patriarch of one of the oldest luxury fashion houses in America, a woman whose opinion could make or break careers, whose personal collection was rumored to be worth more than some small country's GDP. I don't understand," I managed. "Your wedding dress, dear. The 1940s restoration with the hand-beaded French lace overlay. It's currently hanging in my private studio in Manhattan. I acquired it yesterday from a vintage dealer who recognized the quality of the workmanship and brought it to my attention immediately." The world stopped moving. "My dress? You have my dress?" "Indeed I do. And Miss Sullivan, it's perhaps the most exquisite example of vintage restoration I've seen in 30 years.
The attention to detail, the respect for the original construction while modernizing the silhouette, the hand beadwork that must have taken months to complete, it's museum quality work. I sank into one of the chairs in the bridal shop's waiting area, my legs suddenly unable to support me. I don't understand how it got to you. The dealer who brought it to me said he acquired it from a donation center, along with several other pieces. Apparently, someone donated it by mistake. I immediately recognized it as one of your pieces from the photographs on your website. The attention to historical accuracy combined with modern wearability is unmistakable. Victoria Hartwell had seen my work. Victoria Hartwell owned my dress. Victoria Hartwell was calling me personally. I felt like I was having some kind of elaborate hallucination. Miss Sullivan, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. This is all very overwhelming. I imagine it is. But I have a proposition for you. Would you be available to come to my studio tomorrow afternoon? I'd like to discuss a business opportunity and, of course, return your dress. A business opportunity?
Who understands that true luxury lies not in price tags or brand names, but in the kind of meticulous craftsmanship that can't be rushed or replicated by machines. I looked through the glass doors of the fitting room, where Jessica was checking her watch with visible impatience, probably wondering why I was taking so long with a simple phone call. "I'll be there," I said. "Excellent. And Miss Sullivan, bring your portfolio. All of it." After I hung up, I sat in that chair for a full minute, trying to process what had just happened. Victoria Hartwell wanted to meet with me about a business opportunity, and she had my dress. I walked back into the fitting room, where Jessica was scrolling through her phone, looking bored. "Who was that?" she asked without looking up. "Someone who found my dress." Her head snapped up, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Disappointment? Annoyance? Found it where? "A vintage dealer in Manhattan bought it and recognized the quality of the work. They're returning it to me tomorrow." Jessica's perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the tightness around her eyes. "Well, that's lucky. Though honestly, Emma, now that we're here, shouldn't you at least consider some alternatives? I mean, you could buy something proper and keep your little project as a backup." But I was already changing out of the ball gown, my hands steady for the first time in 3 days. "No, Jess, I'm going to wear the dress I made, the dress that someone who actually understands fashion thinks is museum quality." "Museum quality?" She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Emma, whoever called you was probably just being polite. Don't let some random vintage dealer inflate your ego." I looked at her reflection in the mirror as I zipped up my jeans. "Her name is Victoria Hartwell." Jessica's face went completely white. Even someone who worked in marketing for a luxury brand knew that name, knew what it represented in the fashion world. "Victoria Hartwell called you, personally?" "She wants to meet with me tomorrow about a business opportunity." Jessica stood up so quickly that she knocked over her purse, sending the contents scattering across the fitting room floor. "That's impossible. Victoria Hartwell doesn't call random people. She doesn't take meetings with elementary school teachers who sew as a hobby." "Apparently she does." As we left the bridal shop, Jessica was unusually quiet, her usual stream of commentary replaced by a thoughtful silence that felt somehow ominous. I should have recognized the signs, should have known that Jessica, at her most dangerous, was Jessica who felt threatened. But I was too caught up in the impossibility of what was happening to pay attention to the storm clouds gathering in my sister's eyes. I had no idea that the meeting with Victoria Hartwell would reveal not just opportunities I'd never dreamed of, but truths about the people closest to me that would change everything I thought I knew about my life. The next morning, I stood in front of my closet, trying to decide what someone wears to meet Victoria Hartwell.
Every outfit seemed either too casual or like I was trying too hard. Finally, I settled on a navy wrap dress I'd altered to fit perfectly, paired with vintage pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. Simple, classic, authentic. Michael had offered to drive me into Manhattan, but I declined. This felt like something I needed to do alone, a moment that belonged entirely to me. As the train pulled into Grand Central, my portfolio bag felt impossibly heavy in my lap, weighted with 3 years of secret work that might finally see the light of day. The Hartwell Fashion Building occupied an entire block in the Garment District, its Art Deco facade a testament to nearly a century of American luxury fashion. The lobby was all marble and brass, with black and white photographs of iconic Hartwell designs spanning the decades. I recognized several pieces from fashion history textbooks, garments that had defined entire eras of American style. The elevator carried me to the 20th floor in silence, and when the doors opened, I stepped into a world I'd only seen in magazines. The reception area was flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows, and every surface seemed to glow with understated elegance. A young woman with impeccable posture and a smile that looked professionally calibrated directed me to a seating area where I waited, trying not to fidget with my portfolio straps. "Miss Sullivan?" The voice belonged to a woman in her 70s, silver-haired and graceful, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than my car. Victoria Hartwell moved with the kind of confidence that comes from decades of being the most important person in any room she entered. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." She led me through a series of corridors lined with fashion sketches and fabric samples, past rooms where designers worked at drafting tables covered with swatches and patterns. The creative energy of the place was palpable, humming with the kind of focused intensity that comes from people who are genuinely passionate about their craft. Her private studio was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The space was part workshop, part museum, with vintage dress forms displaying garments from different decades, each one a masterpiece of design and construction. Natural light poured in from skylights, illuminating work tables covered with the finest fabrics I could imagine. And there, hanging on a padded hanger near the center of the room, was my wedding dress. Seeing it there, in that context, surrounded by pieces that represented the pinnacle of fashion achievement, took my breath away. It looked different somehow, more significant. The morning light caught the beadwork I'd spent weeks perfecting, and the silk seemed to glow with an inner radiance that I'd never noticed in my childhood bedroom. "It's extraordinary," she said, following my gaze. "When Marcus brought it to me yesterday, I initially assumed it was a museum piece that had somehow found its way into the donation system. The construction techniques are historically accurate, the materials are museum quality, and the hand beadwork represents hundreds of hours of meticulous craftsmanship." She moved closer to the dress, her trained eyes scanning every detail with the kind of attention that only comes from a lifetime of studying excellence. But then I noticed the subtle modernizations, the way you've adjusted the silhouette to flatter contemporary body types while maintaining the dress's historical integrity. The reinforcement techniques that ensure durability without compromising the original design aesthetic. This isn't just restoration work. This is innovation. I found my voice finally. I've always believed that vintage pieces deserve to be worn, not just preserved. There's no point in saving something beautiful if no one ever gets to experience its beauty. Exactly.
Victoria's smile was genuine, the kind of expression that transformed her entire face. Most people who work with vintage fall into one of two categories. They're either preservationists who treat every piece like a museum artifact, or they're modernizers who strip away historical character in favor of contemporary trends. Very few people understand how to honor the past while serving the present. She gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs positioned near a wall of windows overlooking the city. "Tell me about your process. How did you learn these techniques?" For the next hour I found myself talking more openly about my work than I ever had before.
I told her about the summers I'd spent with my great-aunt Rose, who had worked as a seamstress in the 1950s and taught me to appreciate the construction methods that made garments last for decades. I described the painstaking research I did before beginning any restoration, studying historical photographs and museum collections to understand not just how things looked but how they were meant to move and feel on the human body. Victoria listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like every word mattered. She asked detailed questions about specific techniques, nodded approvingly when I described my commitment to using period-appropriate materials whenever possible, and seemed genuinely impressed by the business I'd built online. "Your portfolio," she said finally. "May I see it?" I opened my bag with hands that trembled slightly and passed her the leather-bound book that contained photographs of every significant piece I'd completed over the past 3 years. She turned each page slowly, studying the before and after images with the same intensity she'd given my wedding dress. "This evening gown," she said, pausing at a photograph of a 1930s bias-cut dress I'd reconstructed from a badly damaged piece. "The original beadwork was completely destroyed, correct?" "Yes." I had to recreate the entire pattern based on photographs and similar pieces from the same period. It took me 4 months to source beads that matched the originals closely enough. "And this suit," she turned to another page. "1940s Dior. A very early piece, yes. The jacket was in reasonable condition, but the skirt had to be completely rebuilt. The original fabric was too fragile to wear, so I found a bolt of similar wool that had been stored properly and recreated the skirt using the original as a pattern." Victoria closed the portfolio and looked at me directly. "Miss Sullivan, how would you feel about leaving teaching?" The question hit me like a physical force. "I'm sorry. I've been searching for someone with your particular combination of technical skill and artistic vision for the better part of 2 years. Someone who understands that true luxury lies in craftsmanship, not marketing. Someone who can create pieces that honor fashion history while serving contemporary clients." She stood and moved to one of the dress forms, her hand resting lightly on a garment that looked like it had been made for a queen. "The fashion industry has lost something essential over the past few decades. Everything has become about speed, about trends, about creating desire for things that are designed to be discarded within a season. But there's a growing market for pieces that are meant to last, meant to be treasured, meant to become heirlooms. I want to launch a new division within Hartwell Fashion, bespoke pieces for clients who understand the value of true artisanship. Wedding gowns, evening wear, special occasion pieces that are constructed using traditional methods and designed to be worn for decades. Would you be interested in heading that division?" The room felt like it was spinning around me. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you the chance to build something extraordinary. Your own atelier within the Hartwell umbrella, complete creative control over design and construction, access to the finest materials in the world, and compensation that would make your teaching salary look like pocket change." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "I don't understand. You don't really know anything about me. We just met an hour ago." "Miss Sullivan, I've spent 50 years in this industry. I know talent when I see it, and I know passion when I encounter it. What you've accomplished working alone, with limited resources, is remarkable. Imagine what you could create with proper support and unlimited access to materials." She moved back to my wedding dress, her fingers tracing the delicate beadwork with obvious appreciation. "This dress alone represents a level of skill that most fashion school graduates never achieve. And you're completely self-taught?" "Mostly. I learned the basics from my great-aunt, but everything else came from research and experimentation." "Extraordinary." Victoria returned to her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I'd like to make you an offer, Miss Sullivan. Come work for me for 6 months as a trial period. Design and create a small collection of pieces that showcase your vision and skills. If the partnership works for both of us, we'll make it permanent and give you everything you need to build the kind of atelier that fashion history will remember." The offer was so far beyond anything I'd imagined that I couldn't quite believe it was real. "I need to think about this. It's a big decision, and I have obligations. My students, my wedding in 2 weeks. Of course, take all the time you need. But Miss Sullivan, opportunities like this don't come along often. For either of us." She stood and walked to a cabinet near the windows, returning with a small wrapped package. "A wedding gift. Something to wear with your dress." Inside the tissue paper was a necklace that took my breath away. A single strand of pearls with a clasp that looked like it belonged in a museum, the kind of piece that had probably graced the necks of society women for generations. These belonged to my grandmother, Victoria said quietly. She wore them on her wedding day in 1923, and I wore them on mine in 1967. They're meant to be worn by someone who understands their value. I looked up at her, overwhelmed by the gesture. I can't accept this, it's too much. Nonsense. They need to be worn by someone who will appreciate their history. Someone who understands that beauty and craftsmanship deserve to be celebrated, not hidden away. As I left the Hartwell building that afternoon, my wedding dress carefully wrapped in tissue paper and my mind spinning with possibilities I'd never dared to imagine, I realized that my life had just taken a turn I couldn't have predicted. Victoria Hartwell wanted to give me everything I'd dreamed of as an artist, and all I had to do was say yes. But first, I had to get through a wedding, and I had to figure out how to tell Michael and my family about an opportunity that would change everything we'd planned together. The train ride back to Millbrook passed in a blur of Connecticut suburbs and swirling thoughts. By the time I reached my parents' house, I'd made a decision about the job offer, but I still wasn't sure how to explain what had happened without sounding like I'd lost touch with reality. Michael was waiting in the driveway when I arrived, leaning against his car with the patient expression of someone who'd been there for a while. When he saw me emerge from my rideshare with my wedding dress and a shell-shocked expression, he crossed the distance between us in 3 quick strides. "How did it go?" he asked, taking the dress from my arms with careful reverence. "She offered me a job." "Victoria Hartwell offered you a job. Not just any job. She wants me to head a new division. My own atelier, unlimited resources, complete creative control. Michael, she thinks I could be something extraordinary." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with those dark eyes that always seem to see more than they should. "And how do you feel about that?" "Terrified. Excited. Completely overwhelmed. I keep thinking this has to be some kind of mistake, that she'll realize I'm just an elementary school art teacher who sews as a hobby and withdraw the offer." "Emma." His voice was gentle but firm. "You're not just a teacher who sews as a hobby. You're an artist. You've always been an artist. The only person who doesn't see that is you." We stood there in my parents' driveway, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn, and I realized that this moment felt like a threshold. Everything that came before had been preparation for this decision, this choice between the safe, predictable life I'd built, and the uncertain, thrilling possibility that Victoria Hartwell was offering. "There's something else," I said, remembering the weight of the jewelry box in my purse. "She gave me a wedding gift." I showed him the pearls, and his reaction was immediate and intense. His face went completely pale, and he reached for the necklace with hands that weren't quite steady. "Where did she get these?" he asked, his voice strangely tight. "They belonged to her grandmother. She said they were meant to be worn by someone who understands their value." I looked at him more closely, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the jewelry box. "Michael, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He was quiet for so long that I started to worry something was seriously wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was afraid it would change how you saw me." My stomach dropped. "What kind of something?" "My last name isn't Thompson, it's Hartwell. Victoria Hartwell is my grandmother." The world tilted sideways. I felt my knees buckle and had to grab his arm to stay upright. "Your grandmother. Victoria Hartwell is your grandmother. I know how this sounds. I know you must think I've been lying to you for 2 years, manipulating you somehow. But Emma, I swear to you, this isn't what it looks like." "Then what is it like?" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended, but I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been pretending to be someone you're not for our entire relationship." "I have been pretending," he said quietly. "But not about the things that matter. Not about how I feel about you, or why I fell in love with you, or what I want our life together to look like." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make 1,000 times when he was trying to find the right words. "When I left college, my grandmother wanted me to come work for the company immediately. Executive position, corner office, fast track to running the business someday. But I wanted to prove myself first. I wanted to learn what I was passionate about, what I could contribute to the world beyond my last name and my trust fund. So you became a photographer. I became a photographer who documents traditional craftspeople and artisans. I wanted to understand what it means to create something with your hands, to build a skill over years of practice instead of inheriting success. I've been working on a book about artists who preserve traditional techniques in a modern world. The pieces started clicking together in my mind. That's how you found me. You weren't just some random guy at an art fair. I'd been following your work online for months. Your approach to vintage restoration, your respect for historical techniques while making pieces wearable for contemporary life, it was exactly what I was looking for. But when I met you in person, when I saw how passionate you were about your work, how genuine and unpretentious you were about your art, I fell in love with you as a person, not as a subject for my documentation. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man I'd thought I knew with this new information. Why didn't you tell me? 2 years, Michael. 2 years of letting me think you were just a struggling photographer. Because I was afraid you'd think I was using you. Afraid you'd question whether I really loved your work, or if I was just fascinated by you as an example of something I was studying. And then the longer I waited, the harder it became to tell the truth, without it looking like I'd been intentionally deceiving you. You were intentionally deceiving me. About my name and my family, yes, but never about my feelings for you. Never about believing in your talent, or wanting to build a life with you. I looked down at the pearls in their velvet box, understanding now why Victoria Hartwell had given them to me, why she'd been so interested in my work, why the job offer had come with such certainty. She knows, doesn't she? Your grandmother knows about us. She's known from the beginning. I told her about you months ago, showed her your work, explained why I thought she should pay attention to what you were creating. But Emma, I swear to you, her interest in your work is genuine. Those pearls, that job offer, they're not charity or some elaborate scheme to welcome you into the family. She recognizes your talent because it's extraordinary. How can I believe that? How can I believe any of this is real when it's all connected to your family's company? Michael was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Because 2 days ago, when you called me crying about your dress being thrown away, I had no idea it would end up at my grandmother's studio. I had no idea she would see your work, and immediately understand what I've been trying to tell her for months. This isn't some elaborate setup, Emma. This is what happens when talent meets opportunity. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that everything I thought I knew about our relationship was still true, just viewed from a different angle. But the revelation felt like a betrayal, like discovering that the foundation of our entire relationship had been built on sand. I need time to think, I said finally. About all of this. The job, the truth about who you are, what this means for us. I understand, but Emma, please remember that regardless of my last name or my family's company, I fell in love with you because of who you are. Because you're talented, and passionate and genuine, in a way that most people never manage to be. That hasn't changed. As I walked into my parents' house, my wedding dress in my arms and my world turned completely upside down, I realized that Jessica had been right about one thing. I had been living a life that was smaller than what I was capable of. But what she'd never understood was that some people choose smaller lives not because they're afraid of taking up space in the world, but because they're waiting for the right moment to expand into everything they're meant to become. The question now was whether I had the courage to step into that larger life, especially when it came attached to complications I'd never anticipated. That evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the tools and materials I'd used to create my wedding dress, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The pearls sat on my dresser, catching the light from my bedside lamp, and casting tiny reflections on the ceiling. My wedding dress hung in the closet, cleaned and pressed and ready for a ceremony that was now less than 2 weeks away. Everything I thought I knew about my life had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to move forward. The job offer was everything I'd dreamed of, but accepting it would mean leaving the safe, predictable world I'd built for myself. The truth about Michael's identity explained so much about our relationship, but it also made me question whether anything I'd believed about us was real. And somewhere in Hartford, Jessica was probably going about her evening routine, completely unaware that her act of sabotage had set in motion events that would change all our lives forever.
Because while she'd been focused on diminishing my choices and making me feel small, the universe had been preparing to show her exactly how wrong she'd been about everything. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I went to work, taught my students about color theory and perspective, graded papers and planned lessons as if my entire world hadn't shifted on its axis. But every quiet moment was filled with the weight of decisions I wasn't ready to make, and truths I wasn't sure how to process. Michael had given me space, as promised, but I could feel his presence in the careful distance he maintained. Text messages that were supportive but not pushy, phone calls that lasted just long enough to reassure me he was still there without pressuring me to talk about things I wasn't ready to discuss. It was considerate and maddening in equal measure, because part of me wanted him to fight harder, to convince me that everything he'd told me was true. Victoria Hartwell had also respected my request for time to consider her offer, but she'd made it clear that the opportunity wouldn't wait indefinitely. Fashion weeks were planned months in advance, and if she was going to launch a new division, she needed to know soon, so she could begin building the framework that would support it. I'd managed to avoid Jessica since returning from Manhattan, claiming work obligations and wedding errands that kept me busy and unavailable for her helpful suggestions. But on Thursday evening, she appeared at my parents' front door, with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant, and the determined expression of someone who wasn't going to be put off any longer. "We need to talk," she announced, pushing past me into the living room, with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. "You've been avoiding me for 3 days, and I know something happened when you went to get your dress back." I followed her into the kitchen, where she was already unpacking containers of pad thai and green curry, as if she owned the place. Our parents were at their weekly bridge game, so the house felt larger and quieter than usual, the kind of space where conversations carried weight they might not have in daylight. "I haven't been avoiding you," I said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. "I've just been busy thinking about some decisions I need to make." "What kind of decisions?" Jessica's tone was carefully casual, but I could see the tension in the way she arranged the takeout containers with unnecessary precision. "Please tell me you're not second-guessing the wedding." "Emma, cold feet are completely normal, but making major life decisions based on momentary panic is exactly the kind of thing you'll regret later." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and realized that somewhere in the past few days, I'd stopped seeing her through the lens of our childhood dynamic. Jessica was beautiful and successful and confident, but sitting there in our parents' kitchen, she seemed smaller somehow. More fragile. As if the foundation of her self-assurance was less solid than she'd always pretended. "I'm not second-guessing the wedding," I said carefully. "But some other things have come up that might change our plans after we're married." "What kind of things?" I'd been dreading this conversation, but I realized there was no way to avoid it without outright lying. And despite everything that had happened between us, Jessica was still my sister. She deserved to know that the life she'd been so determined to fix was about to become something she'd never imagined. "The woman who returned my dress offered me a job." Jessica paused with her chopsticks halfway to her mouth. "A job doing what?" "Heading a new division at her company. Designing and creating bespoke pieces for clients who want true artisanship instead of mass-produced fashion." "What company?" I took a breath and prepared for the explosion. "Hartwell Fashion." The chopsticks clattered to the table. Jessica stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and dawning horror. "Hartwell Fashion." As in Victoria Hartwell, the most powerful woman in American luxury fashion. "That Hartwell Fashion?" "Yes." "You're telling me that Victoria Hartwell personally offered you a job based on a wedding dress you made in your bedroom?" She called it museum-quality work. She said she'd been looking for someone with my particular combination of technical skill and artistic vision for 2 years. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, her face cycling through expressions as she processed this information. When she finally spoke, her voice was strangely flat. "This is exactly like you, Emma. Stumbling into opportunities you never worked for, having success handed to you by people who don't understand what the real world is like." The words stung, but they also clarified something I'd been struggling to understand.
What do you mean by that?
"You've always had things come easy to you. School, college scholarships, now apparently fashion careers that fall out of the sky. You never have to fight for anything, because people just give you what you want." I stared at her, genuinely confused. Jessica, what are you talking about? You're the one who's always had everything come easily. You were valedictorian, prom queen, married to a successful man with a perfect life in the suburbs. None of that was easy, she said, her voice rising. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to build the life I have? How many hours I put in at the office, how carefully I've had to manage my image, how much pressure there is to maintain the level of success people expect from me. But you chose that life. You wanted the corner office, and the designer wardrobe, and the house in West Hartford. Because I thought that's what success looked like. Because I thought if I worked hard enough and performed well enough, I'd finally feel like I'd earned my place in the world. Jessica's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the tears that were starting to form in her eyes. But you just exist, Emma. You just create things because you love creating them. And somehow that's enough. Somehow the universe rewards you for being authentic in a way it never has for me. I felt like I was seeing my sister clearly for the first time in years. Jess, are you saying you threw away my dress because you were jealous? I threw away your dress because I was trying to save you from making a mistake that would ruin your life. But her voice lacked conviction, and we both knew the truth was more complicated than that. No, you threw it away, because you couldn't stand the idea that something I made with my hands might be more valuable than anything you could buy with your credit card. The accusation hung in the air between us, and I watched Jessica's face crumble as she realized I was right. The tears came then, not the polite moisture of someone trying to maintain composure, but the ugly, honest crying of someone whose carefully constructed worldview was falling apart. I've been so horrible to you, she whispered. For years I've been telling myself I was helping you, protecting you from your own lack of ambition. But really I was just trying to convince myself that my way was the right way, that all the sacrifices I made for success were worth it. I reached across the table and took her hand, surprised by how fragile it felt. Jessica, you don't have to choose between success and authenticity. You can have both. Can I? Because it feels like I've spent so much time performing the role of a successful woman that I don't remember who I actually am underneath all of it. We sat there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by cooling takeout and the weight of honesty we'd never shared before. And for the first time since we were children, I felt like I was talking to my actual sister instead of the polished version she presented to the world. There's something else, I said finally. About Michael. Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable. What about Michael? His last name isn't Thompson, it's Hartwell. Victoria Hartwell is his grandmother. If I thought Jessica's reaction to the job offer had been dramatic, her response to this revelation was seismic. She went completely pale, then flushed red, then pale again, as if her body couldn't decide how to process the information. Michael is Victoria Hartwell's grandson. He's been working as a photographer to prove himself before joining the family business. He wanted to earn his place instead of inheriting it. So the man I've been calling a struggling artist with no prospects is actually heir to one of the most successful fashion empires in America.
Yes.
Jessica buried her face in her hands. Oh my God, Emma, the things I've said about him, the way I've talked about your future together. I've been so incredibly wrong about everything. You were judging him based on appearances instead of character. The same way you've been judging my choices for years. I know, her voice was muffled by her hands. I know, and I hate myself for it. But Emma, how are you not furious with him? He lied to you for 2 years, about who he really was. I'd been asking myself the same question since Michael's revelation, and I was surprised by the answer I'd reached. Because the parts of him that I fell in love with are all real. His passion for his work, his respect for craftsmanship, his belief that authenticity matters more than status. Those things don't change, because his last name is different than I thought. But doesn't it bother you that he kept such a huge secret? It bothers me that he felt like he had to. But I understand why he did it. In a way, we were both living smaller versions of ourselves, because we were afraid of being judged for who we really were. Jessica looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. What do you mean? I've been hiding my design work for 3 years, making excuses for why I don't tell people about the business I've built, or the recognition I've earned. I was afraid people would think I was getting above myself, trying to be something I wasn't qualified to be. Like me. You were afraid people would react like me. Sometimes yes. But also because I was afraid I might not be as good as I hoped I was. It's easier to keep something secret than to risk having it criticized or dismissed. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, picking at her food without eating. So what are you going to do? About the job, about Michael, about everything. I'm going to say yes to Victoria Hartwell's offer. And I'm going to marry Michael next week as planned, because I love him regardless of his last name or his family's money. Just like that. You're going to completely change your life, based on one conversation with a woman you'd never met before this week. I'm going to stop hiding from my own potential, because other people might have opinions about my choices. I looked at Jessica directly. The question is, what are you going to do?
Hey,
What do you mean? I mean, are you going to keep performing the role of someone you think you should be, or are you going to figure out who you actually want to become? Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. I don't even know where to start. Maybe you start by apologizing to Michael for the way you've treated him. And maybe you start asking yourself what you actually enjoy about your work, instead of just focusing on whether it makes you look successful. And if I discover that I don't actually like my life as much as I've been pretending to, then you change it. You're smart and capable and hardworking. You can build whatever kind of life you want, as long as you're honest about what that is. The conversation continued for another hour, covering years of accumulated misunderstandings and buried resentments.
The time Jessica left, we both felt emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter, as if we'd finally put down burdens we'd been carrying for too long. But even as I felt hopeful about the possibility of rebuilding my relationship with my sister, I knew that the real tests were still coming. Because in less than a week, I'd be walking down the aisle wearing a dress that represented everything I was capable of creating, marrying a man whose true identity would shock everyone who thought they knew us, and stepping into a future that would require more courage than I'd ever needed before. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was grading papers at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang, and I opened the door to find a young man in an expensive suit holding a large manila envelope. Miss Sullivan. I'm Marcus Chen, senior buyer for Hartwell Fashion. Mrs. Hartwell asked me to deliver this personally. Inside the envelope was a formal contract for the position Victoria had offered, along with a letter written in her distinctive handwriting. Dear Emma, it began. I wanted you to have the specifics of our offer in writing so you could review them with anyone whose opinion you value. As you'll see, the terms are quite generous, because I believe you're going to transform not just our new division but the entire industry's approach to luxury craftsmanship. I hope you'll say yes, but I'll understand if you need more time to consider such a significant change. Either way, I look forward to seeing you in your beautiful dress next weekend. With warmest regards, Victoria. I read through the contract twice, hardly believing the salary figure and the creative freedom it outlined. Victoria wasn't just offering me a job, she was offering me the chance to build something entirely new, something that honored traditional techniques while serving contemporary clients who valued authenticity over trends. But it was the postscript at the bottom of her letter that made me smile. I should mention that my grandson has been absolutely insufferable this week, moping around my studio and asking if I've heard from you every few hours. Please put the poor boy out of his misery soon. I was still laughing when my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in days I answered immediately. Emma, is everything okay? Marcus said he delivered the contract this morning. I just finished reading it. Michael, the offer is incredible. It's everything I've dreamed of and more. So you're going to accept? I'm going to accept, but first I need to know something. When you told your grandmother about me, about my work, were you trying to orchestrate this? Were you hoping she'd offer me a job? No, his answer came without hesitation. I told her about you because I was proud of you, because I wanted her to see the kind of talent and integrity that existed outside the fashion industry establishment. I never imagined she'd want to hire you, honestly. I thought she might buy a piece or two for her personal collection. And you're okay with this, with me potentially working for your family's company? Emma, I'm proud of you. Whether you worked for my grandmother or taught elementary school for the rest of your life, I'd be proud of you. But watching you discover what you're truly capable of, seeing you step into your own power, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. Even if it means our lives are going to be more complicated than we planned, especially because of that. I fell in love with a woman who restored vintage dresses in her spare time and turned them into works of art. The fact that the rest of the world is finally recognizing what I've known all along doesn't change how I feel about you. It just means I get to watch you shine in front of a bigger audience.
That afternoon, I called Victoria Hartwell's office and formally accepted her offer. I would start work the Monday after my honeymoon, beginning with a 3-month intensive program to familiarize myself with Hartwell's operations and client base. By Christmas, I'd be launching the artisan division with a small collection of pieces that would debut at New York Fashion Week. The conversation with Victoria was brief and professional, but I could hear the satisfaction in her voice when I told her my decision. "Excellent, my dear. I think you're going to find this experience quite rewarding. And Emma, don't let the industry establishment intimidate you. They're going to try to convince you that you don't belong in their world, but you have something they'll never understand. You have integrity." That evening, Michael came to dinner at my parents' house for the first time since his revelation about his identity. The conversation was initially awkward, with my father asking pointed questions about Michael's family business and my mother trying too hard to act as if nothing had changed. But gradually the tension eased as it became clear that Michael was still the same thoughtful, genuine person they'd come to care about over the past 2 years. It was my father who finally addressed the elephant in the room directly. "So Michael, should I be calling you Mr. Hartwell now?" Michael laughed, the first completely relaxed sound he'd made all evening. "I hope not, sir. I've been Michael Thompson for 2 years, and I'd like to stay that way for a while longer. At least until Emma decides if she wants to take my name or if we should both just go by Sullivan." "That's not how marriage works," my mother said with a smile. "Though I suppose nothing about this situation is particularly traditional." "No, it's not," Michael agreed. "But I've learned that the best things in life rarely are." As the evening progressed, I watched my parents gradually adjust to the new reality of who Michael was and what our future would look like. They asked practical questions about where we'd live, whether I'd continue teaching during the transition, how often we'd visit Millbrook once we were settled in our new life. The answers weren't entirely clear yet, but for the first time since Victoria Hartwell had called me a week ago, I felt like the pieces of my future were starting to align in a way that made sense. I would marry the man I loved regardless of his complicated family history.
I would accept the job offer that would let me build something extraordinary, and I would stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. But even as I felt confident about the major decisions, I knew that the real test would come at the wedding itself, because Jessica had promised to be there, and our entire extended family would be witnessing a ceremony that was very different from what any of them expected. They thought they were watching a small-town teacher marry a struggling photographer. What they'd actually be seeing was something much more complicated and much more interesting. The question was whether they'd be ready for the truth when it was finally revealed. The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of light that photographers dream about and brides pray for. I woke before my alarm, filled with an energy that felt different from the nervous anticipation I'd expected. Instead of anxiety about the day ahead, I felt a deep sense of rightness, as if all the scattered pieces of my life were finally clicking into place. My wedding dress hung in the window of my childhood bedroom, catching the early morning sun in a way that made the hand-beaded details shimmer like captured starlight. Looking at it now, knowing the journey it had taken from my bedroom to a Manhattan atelier and back again, I understood that it represented more than just something beautiful to wear on my wedding day. It was proof of everything I was capable of creating when I stopped hiding from my own potential. Jessica knocked on my bedroom door at 7:30, carrying a tray with coffee and the kind of elaborate breakfast that our mother only produced for special occasions. She looked different somehow, softer than she had in years, as if our conversation 3 days earlier had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for longer than either of us realized. "The bride's breakfast," she announced, setting the tray on my dresser with careful precision. "Mom's been cooking since 5 a.m. I think she's channeling her nervous energy into food preparation." She paused in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Emma, before this day gets crazy with photographers and family and all the chaos of the ceremony, I need to say something." I sat up in bed, pulling my robe around me. "What is it?" "I owe you an apology, not just for throwing away your dress, though that was unforgivable. I owe you an apology for years of trying to make you feel like your choices weren't good enough, like your dreams were too small or unrealistic." Jessica moved closer, perching on the edge of my bed with the careful grace of someone wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about performing a role instead of living authentically. And I realized that I've been so afraid of not being successful enough, of not living up to some impossible standard, that I forgot to ask myself what would actually make me happy. And what would make you happy? I don't know yet, but I think that's the point. I think I need to stop being so afraid of not having all the answers that I never give myself permission to explore the questions. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a small wrapped package. I have something for you. A real wedding gift this time, not an act of sabotage disguised as helpfulness. Inside the tissue paper was a vintage brooch, Art Deco in style, with intricate metalwork and small diamonds that caught the light with every movement. It was exactly the kind of piece I would have spent hours admiring at an estate sale, the kind of treasure that spoke to my love of craftsmanship and historical detail. It belonged to our great-aunt Rose, Jessica said quietly, the one who taught you to sew. Mom gave it to me when I got engaged, but I never wore it because it didn't match my aesthetic. It seemed too old-fashioned, too sentimental for the image I was trying to project. I turned the brooch over in my hands, feeling the weight of its history and the love that had gone into creating something so beautiful. Jessica, this is perfect. It belongs with someone who understands its value, someone who appreciates the artistry that went into making it instead of just seeing it as an outdated accessory. We sat together in the quiet of the early morning, sisters in a way we hadn't been for years, connected by honesty instead of divided by competition. And for the first time since we were children, I felt like Jessica was truly seeing me instead of seeing a reflection of her own insecurities. The morning passed in a blur of preparation and arrival of family members who'd traveled from across New England for the ceremony. My cousins from Vermont appeared with their children and an enthusiasm for small-town weddings that made everything feel more festive. My father's brother drove up from New Jersey with his wife and their contribution to the reception buffet, homemade pierogies that had been a family tradition for as long as anyone could remember. But it was Michael's family that created the most interesting dynamic. Victoria Hartwell arrived at 11:30 in a car that looked like it belonged in a museum, driven by a man who was clearly more than just a chauffeur. She wore a dove gray suit that was perfectly tailored and probably cost more than my parents' mortgage payment, but she carried herself with the kind of understated elegance that made expensive clothes look effortless rather than showy. My mother, bless her heart, treated Victoria exactly like she would any other family member, offering her coffee and homemade coffee cake while asking if she'd had trouble finding the house. Victoria seemed genuinely charmed by the casual hospitality, settling into our kitchen like she'd been visiting for years instead of minutes. "Your home is lovely," she told my mother, accepting a second cup of coffee with obvious pleasure. "It has the kind of warmth that you can't purchase or design. It comes from genuine care and attention to the people who live here." I watched this interaction from the doorway, fascinated by the way Victoria adapted to our family's casual style without losing any of her natural authority. She asked my father about his work, complimented my mother's cooking, and generally behaved like a grandmother who happened to own a fashion empire instead of a business muggle who happened to be related to the groom. But it was her interaction with Jessica that surprised me most. When Jessica appeared in the kitchen wearing a cocktail dress that screamed expensive designer, Victoria studied her with the same assessing gaze she'd given my wedding dress. "You work in marketing, I understand," she said, her tone conversational, but somehow weighted with more significance than a casual comment. "Yes, for Luxe Brands in Hartford. We handle marketing campaigns for several high-end fashion companies. Interesting work. Tell me,
do you think is the most effective way to communicate authenticity to consumers who've become skeptical of marketing promises?" Jessica paused, clearly recognizing that this wasn't idle conversation, but some kind of professional assessment. "I think the key is finding ways to let the product speak for itself instead of trying to convince people why they should want it. But that requires having something genuinely valuable to offer in the first place." Victoria smiled, the kind of expression that suggested approval mixed with interest. Precisely. Most marketing focuses on creating desire for things people don't actually need. But the most successful luxury brands understand that their job is to find people who already understand the value of what they're offering. I left them talking and went upstairs to begin the process of transforming myself from elementary school art teacher to bride. My dress fit perfectly, the months of careful construction paying off in the way the silk moved with my body, and the beadwork caught the light at every angle. Victoria's pearls added exactly the right touch of elegance without overwhelming the vintage character of the gown. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different exactly, but because I looked like someone who belonged in the life I was about to step into. The dress, the pearls, the confidence that came from knowing I'd created something beautiful with my own hands, all combined to transform me into a version of myself that I'd never quite believed was possible. The ceremony took place in Riverside Gardens, the venue Jessica had initially criticized as too rustic, but which looked absolutely perfect in the late afternoon light. String lights wound through the trees, created a canopy of soft illumination, and the sound of the Connecticut River provided a gentle background to the classical music my mother had insisted upon. Our guests filled the white wooden chairs we'd rented, a mix of family members, teaching colleagues, Michael's photographer friends, and a few faces I didn't immediately recognize but assumed were connected to the Hartwell side of the family. Everyone seemed relaxed and happy, the kind of atmosphere that comes from people who are genuinely pleased to be celebrating something meaningful. But it was when Michael appeared at the altar that I understood how completely everything had changed. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that somehow managed to look both classic and contemporary, and his expression as he watched me walk down the aisle was everything I'd hoped to see on my wedding day. Love, certainty, and a kind of quiet pride that had nothing to do with status or appearance and everything to do with genuine admiration for who I was as a person. The ceremony itself was everything we'd wanted it to be. Personal vows that made several family members cry, music that reflected our shared love of folk traditions, and a celebrant who managed to make the formal words feel intimate and meaningful. When we exchanged rings, Michael's hands were steady and warm. And when he kissed me as his wife for the first time, I felt like we were sealing not just our commitment to each other, but our commitment to building a life based on authenticity rather than expectations. The reception began immediately after the ceremony, with cocktails served on the garden's terrace, while photographers captured the golden hour light that made everything look like a painting. I moved through the crowd in my vintage dress and Victoria's pearls, accepting congratulations and compliments, but always aware of the undercurrent of curiosity about Michael's family and what their presence meant for our future. It was during the cocktail hour that the first revelation occurred. One of my teaching colleagues, Sarah, approached me with obvious excitement and a slightly confused expression. "Emma, I have to ask you something. Is Michael's grandmother really Victoria Hartwell? Like the Victoria Hartwell who's been featured on the cover of Vogue more times than anyone can count?" Before I could answer, Sarah continued, "Because I just overheard her talking to your sister about some kind of job opportunity, and I'm trying to figure out if I'm missing something important about your new family situation." I glanced across the terrace to where Victoria and Jessica were indeed deep in conversation, both of them looking more animated than they had earlier in the day. Yes, that's Michael's grandmother, and yes, it's been quite an adjustment learning about that particular family connection. Sarah's eyes widened. "Emma, do you understand what this means? You're not just marrying Michael Thompson, the photographer. You're marrying into one of the most influential families in American fashion." "I'm marrying Michael because I love him. His family's business doesn't change that." "No, of course not. But Emma, the opportunities this could create for you, especially with your artwork. Have you thought about what this connection might mean for your art?"
I had thought about it, of course. It was impossible not to consider how dramatically my circumstances were changing. But more than that, I thought about how to navigate those changes without losing sight of what mattered most to me. The second revelation came during dinner when Victoria stood to offer a toast to the bride and groom. The conversation gradually quieted as people realized that the elegant older woman in the dove gray suit was about to speak. Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Victoria Hartwell, Michael's grandmother. She paused, and I could see recognition dawning on several faces as people connected her name to her reputation. I wanted to share a few words about this remarkable young couple and what their marriage represents. Victoria's voice carried easily across the reception space, commanding attention in the way that only comes from decades of speaking to influential audiences. I've known Michael since he was a small boy, and I've watched him grow into a man who understands that true
Success comes not from inheritance or privilege, but from dedication to something greater than oneself. His work documenting traditional crafts and artisans has shown me aspects of beauty and skill that I might otherwise have overlooked. She turned slightly toward our table, her gaze finding mine. But it's his choice of partner that has impressed me most. Emma, your work represents everything that's best about American craftsmanship. The attention to detail, the respect for historical techniques, the commitment to creating things that are meant to last rather than meant to impress. You've built something extraordinary without fanfare or recognition simply because you believed it was worth doing. The reception had gone completely quiet now. Everyone focused on Victoria's words and beginning to understand that this wasn't just a grandmother offering fond wishes for the bride and groom. Which is why I'm so pleased to announce that Emma will be joining Hartwell Fashion as the director of our new artisan division, where she'll be creating bespoke pieces for clients who understand the difference between luxury and ostentation. The applause that followed was enthusiastic but also confused as family members and friends tried to process what they'd just heard. Emma Sullivan, elementary school art teacher, was going to be working for one of the most prestigious fashion companies in America, but it was Jessica's reaction that caught my attention most. Instead of looking shocked or jealous, she was smiling with what appeared to be genuine pride and excitement. When the applause died down and conversations resumed, she made her way to our table with obvious purpose. "Emma, I need to tell you something," she said, pulling me aside to a quieter corner of the reception space. "Victoria offered me a job." "She what?" "A position in their marketing department. She said she was impressed by my understanding of how to communicate authenticity to skeptical consumers, and she thinks my experience with luxury brands would be valuable for the launch of your new division." I stared at my sister, trying to process this unexpected development. "Are you going to take it?" "I think I am. It would mean leaving Hartford, leaving the life I've built there, but Emma, for the first time in years, I'm excited about work instead of just anxious about whether I'm successful enough." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dancing, conversations with relatives who were still trying to understand how dramatically our family's circumstances had changed, and stolen moments with Michael, where we could briefly escape the whirlwind of attention and simply be newlyweds enjoying their wedding day. But it was the final surprise of the evening that brought everything full circle. As the reception was winding down and guests were beginning to say their goodbyes, Victoria approached Michael and me with a manila envelope that looked official and important. "A wedding gift from the Hartwell family," she said, pressing the envelope into my hands. "Something to help you begin your new life together." Inside was a deed to a brownstone in Manhattan's Upper East Side, fully furnished and ready for occupancy. The accompanying letter explained that the property had been in the Hartwell family for generations, but had been sitting empty for the past 2 years, waiting for the right people to bring it back to life. "We can't accept this," I said immediately. "It's too much." "Nonsense," Victoria replied. "It's a practical gift. You'll need somewhere to live in the city, and this house has excellent light for design work. There's a studio space on the 3rd floor that I think you'll find quite suitable for your new position." Michael looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly as overwhelmed as I was by his grandmother's generosity. "Grandmother, this is incredibly generous, but are you sure about this?" "Michael, I'm 73 years old, and I've spent the past 50 years building a business that I hope will outlast me.
But businesses don't have legacies. People do. Emma represents the future of what Hartwell fashion can become, and you represent the kind of integrity that will guide that transformation. This house is an investment in both of you. As we drove away from the reception in Michael's car, rice and flower petals still caught in my hair, I looked back at the venue where we'd just celebrated the beginning of our marriage and the transformation of our entire lives. In the space of a single evening, I'd gone from being a small-town teacher to the director of a major fashion division. Jessica had discovered a new direction for her career, and our family had been welcomed into a world we'd never imagined being part of. "Are you ready for this?" Michael asked, reaching over to take my hand as we drove through the quiet Connecticut countryside toward our new life. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for this much change at once," I said, looking down at Victoria's pearls, which had caught the light from the dashboard and were glowing softly in the darkness. "But I'm ready to find out what we can build together." 6 months later, I stood in the Hartwell Fashion Atelier, putting the finishing touches on a wedding gown that would debut at New York Fashion Week in 3 days. The dress was everything I'd dreamed of creating when I'd first started restoring vintage pieces in my childhood bedroom. A perfect marriage of historical technique and contemporary vision that had taken 4 months of meticulous handwork.
Complete. Jessica appeared in the doorway of my studio, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of comfortable work clothes that would have been unthinkable for her 6 months earlier. Her new position at Hartwell had transformed her from someone who performed success into someone who actually felt successful, and the change was remarkable. "The Times photographer is here for the preview shoot," she said, setting one of the coffee cups on my work table. "Are you ready to show the world what Emma Sullivan Hartwell can create?" I'd kept my maiden name professionally, but I'd taken Michael's surname for everything else, enjoying the way it connected me to his family's legacy while allowing me to build my own reputation within the fashion industry. The combination felt right, honoring both my individual identity and my new place in a family that had welcomed me completely. "I think so," I said, stepping back to examine the gown one final time. "It's strange to think that this all started with you throwing away my wedding dress." Jessica laughed, the sound lighter and more genuine than it had been in years. "If I'd known that act of sabotage would lead to all of this, I might have done it sooner." "No, you wouldn't have, because you had to be ready to see value in something besides conventional success. And I had to be ready to stop hiding from my own potential." As we prepared to present my work to the fashion press, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A destroyed wedding dress had revealed truths about love, ambition, family, and the difference between authentic achievement and performed success. Jessica had discovered that she could be genuinely successful, instead of just appearing successful. Michael had learned that he could honor his family's legacy while building his own identity. And I had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The brownstone Victoria had given us had indeed become the perfect home for our new life together. Michael's photography studio occupied the garden level, where he continued documenting traditional craftspeople while also creating promotional materials for my new division. My design studio filled the 3rd floor with natural light and inspiration, and our living space in between felt like the perfect blend of old and new, honoring the building's history while serving our contemporary needs. But perhaps the most satisfying transformation had been watching Jessica grow into someone who derived satisfaction from genuine accomplishment rather than external validation. Her marketing campaigns for the artisan division had been featured in several industry publications, and she'd developed a reputation for understanding how to communicate the value of handcrafted luxury to consumers who had grown skeptical of traditional fashion marketing. The fashion press loved the story of my debut collection, particularly the way it connected to my background as a teacher and my commitment to preserving traditional techniques. But more than the media attention, I loved the fact that my work was reaching
People who understood its value, clients who were willing to invest in pieces that were made to last and designed to become heirlooms. As the photographer began setting up for the shoot that would introduce my work to the world, I touched Victoria's pearls, which I'd worn to every important professional meeting since my wedding day. They'd become a talisman of sorts, reminding me that some things are valuable not because of their price but because of their history, their craftsmanship, and the love that goes into creating and preserving them. The wedding dress that had started this entire journey hung in my studio now, carefully preserved as both inspiration and reminder. It represented everything I'd learned about the importance of believing in your own vision, even when other people couldn't see its value. Especially when other people couldn't see its value. Because sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with someone trying to throw away something precious, only to discover that what they thought was worthless was actually the key to everything they'd been searching for all along. 2 years after that transformative wedding day, I stood in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Dinder Hall, watching models glide across a runway that had been constructed specifically for the Hartwell Fashion Retrospective. The entire fashion world had gathered for what Vogue was calling the most significant fashion event of the decade, a celebration of American craftsmanship that would culminate with the debut of my latest collection. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica, who had once mocked my handmade wedding dress as amateurish, was now standing beside me wearing one of my designs, a midnight blue evening gown that had taken 6 months to complete and had already been featured on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. She looked radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the expensive fabric or impeccable construction, and everything to do with the confidence that came from finally understanding her own worth. "Are you nervous?" she asked, adjusting the vintage diamond bracelet that completed her ensemble. It was another piece from our great Aunt Rose's collection, one that Jessica now wore regularly as a reminder of where true craftsmanship came from. Terrified, I admitted, watching as fashion editors, celebrities and industry leaders took their seats in the front rows. But also excited. This feels like the culmination of everything we've been building toward. The past 2 years had been a whirlwind of growth, challenges and achievements that sometimes felt too extraordinary to be real. The artisan division I'd founded at Hartwell Fashion had become the most talked about luxury brand in America, with a waiting list that extended 18 months and clients who included everyone from tech billionaires to European royalty. But more satisfying than the commercial success was the way my work had inspired a movement toward valuing authentic craftsmanship over mass-produced luxury. Jessica's transformation had been equally remarkable. Her marketing campaigns for the artisan division had revolutionized how luxury brands communicated with consumers, focusing on the stories behind the craftsmanship rather than the status symbols attached to ownership. She'd been headhunted by 3 major fashion houses in the past year, but had chosen to stay at Hartwell, where she felt like she was contributing to something meaningful rather than just profitable. 5 minutes to showtime, announced Marcus Chen, who had become our unofficial coordinator for major events. He'd evolved from senior buyer to something closer to a cultural ambassador, helping bridge the gap between Hartwell's traditional luxury market and the new generation of consumers who valued authenticity over exclusivity. Michael appeared at my elbow, camera in hand but looking more like a proud husband than a working photographer. He'd been documenting the entire process of building the artisan division, creating a visual record of how traditional techniques could be preserved and modernized simultaneously. His book about contemporary craftspeople had been published 6 months earlier to critical acclaim, establishing him as a serious artist in his own right rather than just the heir to a fashion empire. "Victoria's ready for you," he said, nodding toward the backstage area where his grandmother was holding court with a group of international fashion journalists. At 75, she moved with the same authority and grace that had defined her career, but there was something softer about her now, a satisfaction that came from knowing she'd successfully passed her legacy to the next generation. The retrospective had been Victoria's idea, a way to celebrate Hartwell Fashion's centennial while showcasing how the company was evolving for its second century. The evening would feature iconic pieces from the archives alongside contemporary work that honored traditional techniques while serving modern sensibilities. My collection would close the show, representing the future of American luxury fashion. But it was the surprise announcement that Victoria had planned for the end of the evening that would change everything once again. She'd been hinting at major news for weeks, but had refused to share details even with Michael and me. All I knew was that it involved the future of Hartwell Fashion and my role within the company. The lights dimmed, and Anna Wintour's voice filled the hall as she introduced the evening's program. The retrospective began with pieces from the 1920s, when Victoria's grandfather had founded the company with a vision of creating American luxury that could compete with European fashion houses. Each decade was represented by garments that had defined their era, accompanied by archival photographs and interviews with the designers and craftspeople who had created them. I watched from the wings as models showcased evening gowns from the 1940s, cocktail dresses from the 1960s, and power suits from the 1980s. Each piece told a story about changing American values and aesthetics, but also about the consistent commitment to quality and craftsmanship that had sustained the company through decades of industry evolution. When Victoria took the stage to introduce the contemporary section of the show, the audience's attention sharpened noticeably. Fashion insiders knew that major announcements often came during events like this, and there had been speculation for months about Hartwell's plans for succession and expansion. Fashion is often criticized for its obsession with novelty, Victoria began, her voice carrying easily through the museum's acoustics. But at Hartwell, we've always believed that true innovation comes from understanding and honoring the past while boldly embracing the future. Tonight's contemporary collection represents that philosophy in its purest form. The first piece from my collection appeared on the runway, a wedding gown that combined 1930s construction techniques with a thoroughly modern silhouette. The model moved with grace and confidence, the dress flowing around her like liquid silk while catching the museum's dramatic lighting in ways that emphasized every hand-sewn detail. I held my breath as the audience responded with the kind of appreciative murmur that indicated genuine admiration rather than polite approval. These were people who understood the difference between good marketing and exceptional artistry, and their reaction told me that my work was being recognized for what it truly was. Piece after piece followed, each one representing months of meticulous handwork and careful attention to historical accuracy combined with contemporary wearability. Evening gowns that reference 1940s glamour while incorporating modern support and movement. Cocktail dresses that honored 1950s femininity, while reflecting contemporary attitudes about power and sexuality. Daywear that drew inspiration from 1960s innovation while serving the practical needs of modern professional women.
The final piece was my wedding dress, the one that had started this entire journey when Jessica had thrown it away in what she'd claimed was an accident. I'd had it professionally preserved and had been saving it for exactly this moment, when it would represent not just personal history, but the evolution of my artistic vision. As the model wearing my dress took her final walk down the runway, I thought about everything that had changed since that devastating morning when I discovered my carefully crafted gown had been donated to charity. The dress that Jessica had dismissed as amateur work was now being celebrated in one of the world's most prestigious cultural institutions, viewed by an audience that included the most influential people in international fashion. But more than the professional validation, I thought about the personal transformations that had grown out of that moment of crisis. Jessica had evolved from someone who performed success into someone who genuinely achieved it. Michael had found a way to honor his family's legacy while building his own artistic identity. Victoria had discovered a successor who shared her values while bringing fresh perspective to the company's future. And I had learned to stop hiding from my own potential and to embrace the space I deserve to occupy in the world. The applause that followed the show was sustained and genuine, the kind of response that indicated the audience understood they'd witnessed something special. Fashion critics who were notoriously difficult to impress were on their feet, and I could see several editors already making notes on their phones, probably drafting reviews that would appear in tomorrow's publications. But it was Victoria's final announcement that created the evening's most dramatic moment. As the applause died down and the audience settled back into their seats, she returned to the microphone with the composed confidence of someone about to make history. "Before we conclude this evening's celebration," she said, "I have one more announcement to share. After 75 years in this industry and 50 years as the head of Hartwell Fashion, I've decided it's time to pass leadership to the next generation." The hall went completely silent, everyone understanding that they were about to witness a significant changing of the guard in American fashion. Effective immediately, I'll be stepping back from day-to-day operations and assuming the role of Chairman Emeritus. My grandson Michael will become President of Operations, overseeing the company's traditional divisions and international expansion. And Emma Sullivan Hartwell will become Creative Director, with full authority over all design initiatives and the artistic direction of the brand. The announcement hit the fashion world like a seismic event. Cameras flashed, phones buzzed with urgent messages, and I could see journalists frantically updating their stories to reflect this unexpected development. Emma Sullivan, the elementary school art teacher who'd been unknown to the fashion industry just 2 years earlier, was now the creative head of one of America's most prestigious luxury brands. I felt Michael's hand squeeze mine as we made our way to the stage to join Victoria for photos and the brief Q&A session that would follow. The questions came rapidly from journalists who were still processing the magnitude of what they'd just heard. Miss Hartwell, what does this transition mean for the future of American luxury fashion? Victoria smiled, looking completely at ease despite having just announced one of the most significant leadership changes in recent industry history. It means that Hartwell Fashion will continue to evolve while maintaining its commitment to exceptional craftsmanship. Emma and Michael represent the perfect combination of artistic vision and business acumen that will guide us into our second century. Emma, how do you plan to balance traditional techniques with contemporary market demands? I'd been preparing for questions like this for months, but actually answering them in front of the international fashion press felt surreal. I believe that true luxury comes from the marriage of exceptional skill and timeless design. Our clients don't want to follow trends. They want to own pieces that will be as beautiful and relevant 20 years from now as they are today. That requires understanding both historical techniques and contemporary needs. Will you be expanding the artisan division model to other areas of the company? We'll be integrating artisan principles throughout all our design processes, Michael answered, stepping forward with the quiet confidence that had always characterized his public appearances. The goal isn't to eliminate technology or efficiency, but to ensure that every piece we create reflects the human skill and attention to detail that has always defined Hartwell Fashion.
Decision. But watching you tonight, seeing how you've built something extraordinary while staying true to who you are, I understand that you were never really leaving education. You were just expanding your classroom. My mother, who had been quietly emotional throughout the entire evening, squeezed my hand tightly. Your great-aunt Rose would be so proud. She always said you had gifted hands, but I don't think even she imagined you'd touch this many lives with your work. The evening's final surprise came as the reception was winding down and most of the guests had begun to make their departures. Jessica approached me with an expression that I'd learned to recognize as her planning face, the look she got when she was working through the details of something ambitious. "I have a proposition for you," she said, pulling me aside to a relatively quiet area near the museum's reflecting pool. Victoria mentioned that the company is looking to expand its educational initiatives, maybe develop partnerships with art schools and design programs. That's right. We want to create apprenticeship opportunities for young craftspeople who are interested in traditional techniques. What would you think about me developing a comprehensive program, not just marketing or public relations, but actual curriculum development and partnership structuring? I've been researching educational models that combine traditional craftsmanship with contemporary business skills. I looked at my sister, seeing the excitement and genuine passion in her expression. This was Jessica at her best, when she was focused on building something meaningful rather than just advancing her own career. I think that sounds perfect. You understand both the business side and the importance of preserving traditional skills. Plus, you know what it's like to discover your authentic path later than you expected. Exactly. I want to help other people avoid the years I spent performing success instead of actually achieving it. As Michael and I rode home to our brownstone that night, the city lights streaming past the car windows and the weight of the evening's announcements still settling over us, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years earlier, I'd been a small-town teacher whose biggest artistic ambition was finishing a handmade wedding dress. Now, I was the creative director of a major fashion house, responsible for guiding the artistic vision of a company that employed hundreds of people and influenced global luxury markets. But more than the professional achievements, I thought about the personal growth that had made everything else possible. I'd learned to value my own vision enough to pursue it publicly,
Jessica had discovered that authentic success felt completely different from performed success. Michael had found a way to honor his family's legacy while building his own identity. And Victoria had successfully transitioned from building a company to nurturing the people who would carry it forward. The brownstone Victoria had given us as a wedding gift had become more than just a home. It was a symbol of how the right opportunities could transform individual potential into shared achievement. My design studio on the third floor was where I created pieces that would be worn by women around the world. Michael's photography studio in the garden level was where he documented the craftspeople and techniques that informed my work. And our living space in between was where we built a marriage based on mutual respect for each other's authentic ambitions. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in my relationship with Jessica. The sister, who had once thrown away my wedding dress out of jealousy and insecurity, had become my closest collaborator and most trusted advisor. Her marketing genius had been essential to building the artisan division's reputation, and her understanding of how to communicate authenticity to skeptical consumers had influenced everything from our client relationships to our public messaging. 6 months later, I stood in the same Metropolitan Museum hall where we'd held the retrospective, but this time I was there as an honored guest at the museum's annual Costume Institute Gala. My wedding dress, the one that had started everything, was now part of the museum's permanent collection, displayed as an example of contemporary American craftsmanship that honored historical techniques while serving modern sensibilities. The placard next to the dress told the story of its journey from a small-town bedroom to a Manhattan atelier and finally to one of the world's most prestigious cultural institutions. But what it couldn't capture was the human story behind that journey, the way a single act of sabotage had revealed truths about love, ambition, family, and the difference between authentic achievement and performed success. Victoria, now officially chairman emeritus, but still very much involved in major company decisions, stood beside me as we viewed the dress in its museum setting. At 76, she moved more slowly than she had during her active leadership years, but her mind remained as sharp and her opinions as influential as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice thoughtful as she studied the intricate beadwork that had once caught her attention in her private studio. Leaving teaching, taking on all the pressure and responsibility that comes with leading a major fashion house? I considered the question seriously, thinking about the challenges and stress that accompanied my new role, the long hours and difficult decisions and constant pressure to maintain the standards that had built Hartwell's reputation over nearly a century. "No," I said finally. "I loved teaching, and I'll always value the skills and perspective it gave me. But I think I was hiding there, using it as a safe space where I could create without risking real criticism or failure. This feels like I'm finally living up to my actual potential, instead of just a comfortable version of it." And Jessica? How is she adjusting to her new role as Director of Educational Initiatives? Jessica's program had launched 3 months earlier with partnerships at 5 major art schools and design programs across the country. Students could now earn degrees in traditional craftsmanship while also learning contemporary business skills, creating a pipeline of young artisans who understood both historical techniques and modern market realities. "She's thriving in a way I've never seen before," I said, smiling as I thought about my sister's transformation from someone who performed ambition into someone who actually achieved it. She found her authentic calling, and it turns out to be something she's exceptionally good at. The gala continued around us, with fashion industry leaders, celebrities, and cultural influencers celebrating the intersection of art and commerce that defined contemporary luxury. But standing there in front of my wedding dress, now preserved as a piece of American cultural history, I understood that the real story wasn't about fashion or business or even family reconciliation. The real story was about the courage required to stop hiding from your own potential, to risk failure in pursuit of authentic success, and to believe that your vision has value,
even when other people can't see it. Sometimes that courage comes from dramatic moments of crisis, like having your wedding dress thrown away by someone who's supposed to love you. And sometimes it comes from quiet moments of choice, when you decide to pursue what you actually want instead of what other people think you should want. Either way, the transformation that follows is worth every moment of uncertainty and fear that comes with stepping into a larger version of yourself. Because on the other side of that fear is a life that feels genuinely yours, built from your own vision and sustained by your own authentic achievements. As I left the museum that night, walking through the New York streets toward the brownstone that had become home, I touched Victoria's pearls one final time, feeling grateful for everything they represented about heritage, craftsmanship, and the way beautiful things can connect us across generations. The wedding dress that had started this journey was now safely preserved for future generations to study and admire. But the life it had made possible was still being written, one careful stitch at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.